The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to introduce legislation with my colleague from Wisconsin, Senator Baldwin, to reauthorize the Lifespan Respite Care Program. Mr. President, every day, an estimated 53 million family caregivers attend to loved ones across all age groups, disabilities, and chronic conditions. Respite care gives these full-time caregivers a much-needed opportunity to take a temporary break from their important responsibilities. Caregivers help their loved ones remain at home, and the decision to assume these responsibilities full-time often delays the need for nursing home care. While many of these individuals care for an older adult, almost 1/3 of caregivers attend to family members under the age of 50. The value of their efforts is tremendous, amounting to more than $600 billion in uncompensated care each year. This compassionate task, however, can take a tremendous toll. Caregivers experience higher mortality rates and are more likely to acquire acute and chronic health conditions themselves. Respite care helps to reduce mental stress and physical health problems that they may experience, thus helping to keep caregivers healthy and families intact. Yet almost 85% of America's caregivers have never received any respite services. As a senator representing the state with the oldest median age in the nation, the well-being of our older citizens and their caregivers is among my top priorities. Since the Lifespan Respite Care Act was enacted in 2006, 38 states and the District of Columbia have received grants to increase the availability and quality of respite services. Our legislation would extend this programming for another 5 years through fiscal year 2030. Mr. President, in Maine, there are approximately 166,000 family caregivers who provide 155 million hours of care to loved ones each year. The Maine Department of Health highlighted the importance of respite care in a report released earlier this year that evaluates the Maine State Respite Care Program. Participants shared how assistance made available through this program has enabled them to take much-needed breaks, reduce their anxiety, and even re-energize their enthusiasm for caregiving. One Mainer shared that access to respite care has meant that she has been able to truly visit with her parents when she spends times with them, instead of using all of that time just to do their chores, their yard work, and other tasks. She says that it has been wonderful to have someone help care for her parents with their chores and shopping for their needs, and it has meant that she herself is far less tired. Stories such as these emphasize the importance of respite care, of a break for these caregivers who are giving so much to their family members. Although most caregivers are adults, there are also more than 5 million young people in our country who provide care for grandparents, parents, or siblings with disabilities. Studies have found that approximately 1 in 5 young adults who dropped out of school did so to care for a family member. These children often choose to give up activities that other teens should enjoy, such as extracurricular activities, sports, outside activities, and they may experience depression or anxiety. Our legislation would clarify that young people who are caregivers, including those who are under age 18, are also able to access respite care services. Mr. President, there is a large gap between caregivers who need respite services, who need a break from the 24-hour care of their loved ones, and those who actually receive this kind of assistance. Our bill would help close that gap by reauthorizing funding for this program that has helped states establish or strengthen respite services. This funding can be used to assist caregivers in finding available respite services, to train and recruit volunteers, to provide temporary caregiving, and to provide financial support through vouchers so that caregivers can better afford respite services. Our bill is widely supported by leading caregiver and respite organizations, including the ARCH, National Respite Network and Resource Center, the Alzheimer's Association, and the Alzheimer's Impact Movement. Mr. President, our bipartisan legislation will provide the necessary resources to ensure that more caregivers have access to the respite services they need. I urge all of our colleagues to support this important bipartisan legislation. It will make a real difference for the caregivers, the family caregivers in our states. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Thank you. Today, I rise to reaffirm my partnership with Senator Susan Collins in the Lifespan Respite Care Reauthorization Act of 2025. Senator Collins and I recognize the challenges that family caregivers face, and we have worked together over many years to advance legislation to support the essential role that caregivers play in our communities. We were successful in passing legislation that establishes a national strategy to support family caregivers, the Raise Family Caregivers Act. And we are committed to reauthorizing the Lifespan Respite Care Program that supports the health and well-being of family caregivers. Every day, family caregivers in Wisconsin and across our country tend to the needs of their loved ones. Although this work can be very, very rewarding, it can also be emotionally and physically challenging. After serving as my grandmother's primary caregiver as she got older, I know firsthand the time, the dedication, and the sacrifice involved to keep our aging, disabled, or sick loved ones safe and well. Caregiving can be a 24/7 job, and too often family caregivers compromise their own health to ensure that their loved ones are not left in limbo. Respite care offers family caregivers a necessary break to focus on their own mental health and well-being. That's why I was proud to reintroduce our bipartisan legislation so that our family caregivers can access the support and the relief that they need. This bill would support family caregivers by reauthorizing the Lifespan Respite Care Program, which allows full-time caregivers to take a temporary break from their responsibilities, caring for aging or disabled loved ones. Across the country, there are over 53 million Americans who currently provide uncompensated care for their families, which provides an estimated $600 billion in uncompensated care each year. Let that sink in. By protecting the health of caregivers, respite care decreases the need for professional long-term care and allows individuals who require care to remain at home. I look forward to continuing to work with Senator Collins to advance this important legislation in the 119th Congress. And with that, I yield.
The senator from Missouri.
Today to argue for a swift and decisive confirmation of Elbridge Colby as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It is common today to hear leaders in foreign policy establishment talk. Let me restart that. It's common today to hear leaders in the foreign policy establishment talk of upholding the rules-based international order and promoting liberal values and norms. What is much less common is to hear anyone talk about tangible, concrete American interests. Mr. Colby is a welcome exception. He believes that America is a real, concrete nation and people with real, concrete interests, and that the fundamental purpose of our foreign policy is to protect and advance those interests. For the past 30 years, American foreign policy has lurched from disaster to disaster. To be a friend of the reigning consensus is to be an advocate for the same failed ideas that led us to spend trillions of dollars and countless young Americans' lives for causes and conflicts that were not ours, while leaving us woefully unprepared for the ones that are. America does not need more of the same. What America needs is a new approach, a new strategy, a new philosophy of strength for the 21st century. That is what Elbridge Colby will deliver. No one could argue that Mr. Colby isn't qualified for this role. He spent well over 20 years working in the defense and foreign policy, serving in the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and various national security positions at different think tanks. He served faithfully in the first Trump administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, where he was the lead author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. From there, he founded a think tank, the Marathon Initiative, and wrote a book called The Strategy of Denial, outlining his vision for confronting the true geopolitical challenge of our time, deterring and, if necessary, defeating the threats posed by a rising China. President Trump's decision to nominate Mr. Colby to this position was not a mistake. It was intentional. This administration wants to carry out a fundamental and long overdue reorientation of our nation's foreign policy, and Elbridge Colby is a critical component of that mission. The media tells us that he is controversial. Why? Well, he believes that our foreign policy must prioritize our core interests. And that means that we can't be everywhere at once doing everything all the time. His critics say that makes him weak. In reality, it's exactly the opposite. The quickest and most certain path to weakness is to waste our blood and treasure on Wilsonian adventurism abroad. And the real threats and enemies of America grow unchecked. For years, Mr. Colby has been one of the lone voices in the foreign policy establishment with a real and viable vision for American strength. It's true that Mr. Colby believes that the Iraq War was a mistake. He does not believe that a hot war with Iran would serve America's long-term interests. He believes that a costly and unwinnable proxy war in Ukraine is an obstacle to our ability to rebuild our military and revitalize our industrial base here at home, and that our European allies must step up and do more to defend their own continent as the United States transitions to our focus in the Indo-Pacific. All of these things, on all of these things, the decisive majority of Americans are on his side, even if the foreign policy establishment isn't. The political class in this city must come to terms with the fact that the world most of us grew up in no longer exists. President Trump intends to drag this city, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the 21st century. That is what we saw at the White House last week. A new foreign policy centered around uncompromising and unapologetic pursuit of the interests of the American people. Mr. Colby will play a key role in that project, and I look forward to watching him serve as our next Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. On day one, President Trump lit the fuse on Elon Musk's plan to hollow out the federal government by changing the name of an obscure technical office within the White House, the U.S. Digital Services, USDS, and called it DOGE without congressional authorization and giving it extraordinary reach into the operations of the federal agencies. Since then, we have heard report after report about how Mr. Musk and DOGE have rammed their way into agencies, not to make smart decisions, not to improve efficiency, not to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, but to disrupt, denigrate, and demoralize. And along the way, DOGE has made incredible blunders, such as firing and then scrambling to rehire employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration. Let me repeat that. Mr. Musk and his minions fired the people who keep nuclear weapons safe, and then someone realized, fortunately, within a few days, they had to come back. And here's another example. Musk and his hackers made CIA send an unclassified email with the names of its recent hires. Boy, if I was in the Russian security service, I'd love to get a list, which they did, of everyone who's going into the CIA. They also cut staff from the Federal Aviation Administration, the National Weather Service, who prevent and warn every American of travel and weather dangers. And it goes beyond that. Agricultural interests listen daily to the reports, the accurate reports of the Weather Service, so they can plan their crops, they can plan everything. And that's being withered away, and I think the ultimate goal is to privatize it, which is not the best way to go. These actions don't just reflect incredible incompetence, they are dangerous. They undermine national security and increase risk for American citizens. In any other setting, blunders like these would be grounds for firing. But Musk and DOGE operate with arrogance, impunity, and zero transparency. Millions of Americans are asking, who are these people? As the ranking member of the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Subcommittee, the subcommittee that ostensibly oversees the budget for the White House, USDS, and DOGE, I'm asking the same question because Congress, like the American people, is being kept in the dark. As appropriators, we typically work together on a bipartisan basis, no matter which party is in the White House, to get information, to conduct oversight, to ensure that federal dollars are spent in accordance with the laws passed by Congress. But now, without authorization from Congress, DOGE is recklessly slashing its way through virtually every federal agency, from the Office of Personnel Management to Treasury to HUD to State to USAID and to the Department of Defense and more. It's vital that we understand what DOGE is and isn't. While Elon Musk tells us and the American people that DOGE is maximally transparent, it is not. We still do not have answers to fundamental questions like, what is the scope of DOGE's work? How many people work at DOGE, and who are they? Do they also hold jobs outside the federal government? What are their financial holdings and potential conflicts of interest? Do they have allegiances to foreign governments? Will DOGE respond to requests under the Freedom of Information Act? What are its plans to reform agencies? Who is DOGE firing and why? And many, many other questions. And unfortunately, when DOGE shares information, it is frequently wrong. As the New York Times reported, 5 of DOGE's biggest claimed savings were deleted from its website because they were inaccurate. This includes a canceled USAID contract for $650 million, which was counted by DOGE 3 times. A canceled Social Security contract was erroneously listed as being worth $232 million instead of the actual $560,000. And a canceled ICE contract was listed as saving $8 billion instead of $8 million. If you're going to name something the Department of Government Efficiency, don't you owe it to the taxpayers to actually do a good job? On top of having zero accountability, DOGE legal authority to operate is dubious. DOGE has essentially taken over the USDS, which was originally established to help federal agencies more adeptly utilize technology to serve the American people. Over the years, USDS helped establish everything from direct file, which helps taxpayers file their taxes for free, to direct mail COVID tests, to a successful online passport renewal protocol. DOGE is now using the hollowed shell of USDS to illegally undo the American federal government, moving from agency to agency, cutting congressionally appropriated funds, spend priorities, and even dismantling entire agencies. The bottom line is that DOGE is without congressional authorization and without direct funding from Congress is acting to undermine the federal government. And frankly, contempt to the United States Congress as a constitutional body who creates the laws. The president's challenge in the Constitution is to enforce those laws, not to circumvent the Congress of the United States. Based on press report, it appears to be DOGE are populated by a mixture of unelected billionaires, tech executives, and unvetted, inexperienced people, including an individual who is found to have posted racist tweets. This gang is being granted access to America's most sensitive data, like your bank accounts, your Social Security accounts, and it would seem a host of classified intelligence. And how are they using this information? How are they protecting this information from our enemies? Is it being shared with outside entities? Is DOGE simply being used to give Mr. Musk, his companies, and his billionaire friends an advantage when competing for government contracts? We simply don't know what this gang is doing inside the government. Every single day that passes without transparency and congressional access to information about DOGE's funding, staffing, and scope of work is a moment too long. With the current continuing resolution due to expire on March 14th, we have big decisions to make. My hope is that these decisions can be made on a bipartisan basis informed by the facts, but we cannot responsibly fund the government if we do not understand how DOGE has infiltrated it, made it less efficient and less responsive to taxpayers, and essentially has circumvented the constitutional responsibilities of the United States Congress. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the following members be permitted to speak prior to the lunch recess. Myself for up to 15 minutes, Senator Murray up to 10 minutes, Senator Cantwell up to 5 minutes, and Senator Britt for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as everybody knows, tonight President Trump will give an address to a joint session of Congress. I look forward to attending the President's address, and I am happy to welcome my friend Abraham George, who will join me as a guest tonight. In addition, 3 other Texans will be joining the President tonight as his guests. Alexis Nunguri from Houston, Texas, is an angel mom who lost her lovely 11-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. Jocelyn was tragically murdered by 2 illegal immigrants who, just weeks before they were apprehended and released by the Biden administration. Next, from Texas, Roberto Ortiz from Weslaco is one of our brave veterans who served nearly a decade in the U.S. Border Patrol. Roberto's courage in the face of danger has been tested repeatedly as he's been shot on multiple occasions by cartel members while on the line of duty near the Rio Grande River in my home state. And finally, Elliston Berry from Aledo, Texas, is a 15-year-old victim of computer-generated deep fakes. I applaud Elliston for her courage in joining us here tonight, for using her voice to speak out against the dangers imposed by new technologies. President Trump has rightfully turned the page on a wide array of President Biden's disastrous policies, from reforming our runaway spending through DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to prioritizing investment in semiconductors and manufacturing, to bringing our hostages held in Gaza back home to their families. But perhaps one of his most significant accomplishments thus far, and it's only been about 6 weeks, has been when it comes to border security, something near and dear to my heart and the heart of my 31 million constituents who call Texas home. Border security played a significant role in the mandate that the President got last November. The past 4 years were marked by President Biden's failure to enforce the law and to secure our border. And this was without a doubt a crisis, a humanitarian and public safety crisis of the former administration's own making. This was truly a man-made crisis. Starting from the campaign trail, President Biden invited the massive wave of migration by promising a, quote, surge to the border for asylum seekers. Can you imagine a president inviting a surge to the U.S. border of asylum seekers? This is one promise that, unfortunately, he kept. But President Biden's failures went far beyond just his rhetoric. In the early days of his presidency, President Biden basically reversed every policy President Trump had put in place, including the Remain in Mexico policy, which has been remarkably effective. In other words, people seeking asylum need to remain in Mexico while their claim is being processed. And the truth is, only about 15% of people who claim asylum in America who appear in front of an immigration judge ultimately are granted asylum. They meet the legal criteria, whereas the other 85% do not. The Biden administration also halted construction of President Trump's border wall and instead used federal funds to store already paid for wall materials. So not only did the taxpayer pay for those materials, they had to pay for the storage of those materials when they weren't used for their intended purpose. As the border crisis continued to evolve for the worse, President Biden ended Title 42, the COVID-19 policy era policy that was our last line of defense to keep a lid on the migrant crisis when President Biden refused to enforce other laws. After undoing the successful executive orders made by the first President Trump administration, President Biden then decided to circumvent Congress and attempt to make illegal immigration legal, using temporary programs that were never intended for that purpose. His Department of Homeland Security created the CBP One app, the short for Customs and Border Protection, an app for your phone which allowed migrants to literally schedule a visit to a port of entry so they could then claim asylum and then enter the country. Another Biden-Harris administration program allowed up to 30,000 migrants a month to enter from 4 countries, Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So that was 360,000 migrants who were basically told, if you come, you can stay in the United States. But they were conferred a temporary status that left them all in legal limbo. And let's not forget the Biden White House cooking the books on illegal immigration by abusing the parole system. Now, parole is a word that people who are familiar with the criminal justice system understand, but this is different. In immigration terms, parole means you were essentially released into the United States even if you didn't claim a right to be able to stay, for example, a right to asylum. They're just simply released as a border control measure to avoid bad publicity at the border when people were sleeping in the streets and lines were stacking up. Of course, we know what the tragic consequences of these misguided policies look like: a crisis of mass illegal immigration, human trafficking, drug trafficking across our southern border. Approximately 100,000 Americans die each year as a result of drugs that come across the southern border, approximately 70,000 from synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which is the leading cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45. During all 4 years of the Biden administration, the number of illegal migrant encounters with CBP totaled over 10 million. That's basically 10 million people showing up and saying, let me into your country, and the Biden administration said, come on in. But on top of that, there were about 1.7 million gotaways. Now, gotaways are people who were evading law enforcement who appear on some sensor, a camera or some other sensor, and evade law enforcement. And of course, now we know they are freely roaming the interior of the United States. Now, let me ask you this. If you know that you could show up at the border and be allowed to enter, basically ushered into the country, why in the world would you evade Border Patrol? Well, I think the simple answer is these are people who knew that they would not be able to enter because of criminal records, because they were transporting drugs, or engaged in some other illegal activity. Yet they made their way into the interior of the United States. Fentanyl, which I mentioned a moment ago, was manufactured from Chinese precursor chemicals smuggled through the open border, which has taken tens of thousands of lives. And the people of Texas, the 31 million people that I'm honored to represent, have felt the burden of President Biden's disastrous border policies most acutely because we are closest to the problem. We are at ground zero. Governor Abbott, our outstanding governor in the Texas legislature, filled the gap when the federal government refused to do its job along the border. An international border is the responsibility of the federal government, not the state government. But what's the state supposed to do if the federal government says, we don't care about the law, we're not going to enforce it, it's up to you? Well, Governor Abbott and the Texas legislature stepped up, and they spent roughly $11.1 billion to fill the gap that should have been filled by the federal government. And for that reason, I am insisting that Congress fulfill Governor Abbott's request to be reimbursed the $11.1 billion that the state taxpayers had to spend that rightfully should have been the expense of the federal government and federal taxpayers all across the country. There could be no doubt that this historic crisis was the direct result of President Biden's policies, and that's one reason why I believe not only he did not run, but Vice President Harris lost the election. It was a rejection of those open border policies. I'm looking forward to hearing the President discuss tonight the incredible strides his administration has made in just about 6 weeks since his inauguration. Nowhere is that success more apparent than when it comes to border security. After 4 years of record highs, CBP is now facing record lows. The Border Patrol tells me now we can do our job. We're not relegated to changing diapers or transporting migrants from one facility to another. We can actually keep out the worst of the worst and enforce the laws when it comes to border security. As soon as President Trump was elected, even before he took office, the migrant flows began to subside. That's called deterrence. If you know the law is going to be enforced and you know you're not going to be successful making your way into the country, why would you spend thousands of dollars in order to pay off a cartel member to smuggle you up to the border? During November and December of last year, after the election, encounters were at their lowest levels between the ports of entry, the lowest levels since August of 2020. In the first 2 weeks of January, Customs and Border Protection encounters were nearly 50% lower than they were at the same point in January 2021, 50% lower. During the latter half of the month when President Trump actually took office, apprehensions fell by a staggering 85% compared to the same period in 2024. You know, the statement's often made, elections have consequences. Well, one of the most important consequences of President Trump's election on November the 5th was we are now reestablishing border security. And the people of this great country are safer for it. During the entire month of January, there were less than 1,500 apprehensions a day, a nearly 40% decline from December of last year. And just 1 week ago, Customs and Border Protection hit a 15-year low of only 200 encounters in 1 day at the southern border. These numbers are pretty impressive, but they are not at all surprising. They are a direct result of the deterrent effect created by President Trump and Secretary Noem's policy changes. Migrants know that a Trump administration means our laws will be enforced. If you can make your way into our country using legal means, by all means, do so. As I mentioned earlier, our country is the most generous in the world when it comes to legal immigration. We naturalize about 1 million people a year. So if you have a desire to come to America, do it through legal means, not through illegal means. Instead of rolling out the welcome mat like President Biden, President Trump started his second administration by turning the traffic light red instead of green. On day one, President Trump declared a national emergency, which it was, at the southern border, giving him greater flexibility to implement his executive orders. He reinstated the Remain in Mexico policy and ended President Biden's disastrous catch and release policies. Secretary Noem, our new Secretary of Homeland Security, began her tenure in the president's cabinet by sending a clear video message to migrants that she intends to enforce the laws that prevent illegal immigration. But she didn't stop there. Under President Trump and his administration, ICE arrests, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE arrests have increased more than 600%, which include arrests of criminal migrants, which have doubled. They've returned to a common sense case-by-case approach to humanitarian parole, which had been abused under the Biden administration, where it was used as a way to have mass releases of migrants at the border who made no legitimate claim to be able to stay. They were just released. Secretary Noem has also clawed back the $80 million a month spent by FEMA to house illegal migrants in luxury hotels in New York City. That's where your tax dollars went, to put people who had no legal claim to stay in the United States in hotels in New York City to the tune of $80 million. These policies are welcome. They're good news to my constituents in Texas, and I believe to people across the country. There's a reason why Secretary Mayorkas, who the former Secretary of Homeland Security, who was responsible for implementing the border security measures of the Biden administration, there was a reason why he was impeached by the House of Representatives. He simply did not do the job he had sworn to do. Well, Texans have had to bear the brunt of open borders for 4 years, which includes rampant crime and deadly fentanyl. So I look forward to working with President Trump and Secretary Noem to continue the important work they have begun to keep Americans and Texans safe. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, no one wants a shutdown. Well, actually, no one except Elon Musk, who recently said that sounds great, or Donald Trump or Russ Vought. That is why I have been at the table this entire time, ready to pass a bill that protects key investments and makes sure that Congress, not Donald Trump or Elon Musk, decides whether or not our public schools or our life-saving cancer funding research gets funded. Unfortunately, Republican leadership told their members last week to walk away from the negotiating table, which raises the risk of a shutdown in an attempt to pass a clean, year-long continuing resolution that would actually give Trump and Musk exactly what they want: fewer restraints and more power over federal spending so they can pick winners and losers as they see fit, which would hurt all of our constituents. Nonetheless, I am urging Republican leadership to come back to the table. They are willing to do that and work with us on full-year funding bills, the type of work we do together every year, and prevent a shutdown while we do that. We cannot stand by and accept a year-long power grab CR that would help Elon take a chainsaw to programs that families rely on, like yours, or keeps our agencies together that keep our communities safe. We actually have a job to do here, Republicans and Democrats, to be a voice for our constituents, to advocate for the funding that they need, and to get support back to our communities. I've heard my House Republican colleagues say they will not restrict a Republican president's powers. I want to be clear. What I'm asking for is to work together to make sure, as we write and negotiate these full-year spending bills, our laws get followed. I welcome, and I want everyone to know, I'm open to any and all ideas about how we can work together to do that. I am confident, Mr. President, we can get this done. I'm ready to pass a short-term CR immediately to take down the risk of a shutdown so that we can finish our negotiations and write our full-year spending bills, which is our job to do. Now, today, on a topic I believe appropriators actually on both sides of the aisle would agree with, we need far more information and transparency and accountability from the Trump administration in order to write these bills. Because here's one big problem. How are we supposed to fund the government when many of our agencies today are not responding to our questions and we have no clear picture of what is actually or who is actually in charge of many of our agencies? It is clear as day there have been a lot of dramatic changes made across the government. Agencies are being illegally shuttered. Workers are being fired by the thousands, again, often in direct violation of laws we passed, and hundreds of billions of dollars in federal programs and grants have been frozen, unfrozen, frozen again. We've had contracts that have been recklessly canceled, some accidentally and then restarted, not to mention the workers that were fired and rehired. It is incredibly chaotic, and it makes it much harder to write our legislation that actually responds to these latest developments when programs are switching on and off again like a 2-year-old is playing with a light switch, and when the number of people in programs illegally terminated remains unclear. It is much more difficult to write funding bills for department programs when we have no idea what the department is actually doing or what the actual plan is for next year, or it's actually them or perhaps DOGE making the plans in the first place. When we are seeing decisions made and reversed, made and ignored, made by people who have no authority to make them, and yet seemingly being implemented, and it's not just the whirlwind of decisions that are causing this chaos, it is the complete lack of transparency and accountability surrounding these decisions from Trump and Musk that makes it all but impossible to get a straight answer. When we have questions that urgently need answers, like, why has this energy program been frozen? Or when will the NIH grants start up again? Or which VA contracts have actually been scrapped? Or how many workers have been pushed out? Then it helps if we know who's actually in charge. When our constituents have problems that require solutions quickly, or they will have to close a business, or lay people off, or lose their family farm, then it matters that we can get the right person on the phone to get things resolved. And yet, when there's information we urgently need so we can write our funding bills and avoid a shutdown, like agency priorities or unexpected challenges, or just the basic nuts and bolts of stuff, to say nothing of the information we need to address the very extraordinary circumstances and decisions of the past few weeks, it is totally unclear who we should actually be talking to if we want answers that actually reflect the reality of what's happening. It is totally unclear who is actually making these decisions and who is actually in charge. Appropriators have now sent over 30 letters to agencies since January 20th asking to just understand agency actions. And that's to say nothing of the efforts from me and my staff to get answers to our emails and our calls. But the answers have been few and very far between. And what's more, just because we hear something from someone who should know, just because we hear from someone who should be in charge, we have found that does not mean it's actually true. And there's more than one time in the past few weeks where we've been told one thing, only to see the reality is entirely different. Like, for example, when the OMB funding freeze was implemented and we were told it won't affect Head Start, except that it did affect Head Start. Providers in my state were locked out of that payment system for days, even after the funding freeze itself was rescinded. It seems like the only thing that has been consistent about the last few weeks is that every time there's been chaos, every time I see actions that fly in the face of laws we have passed, not to mention common sense, or contradict what I have heard from agency leaders, DOGE has been at the center of it. We have seen DOGE absolutely trample the authority of Congress and other federal agencies, including officials Congress confirmed. For example, while Secretary Rubio instituted a recklessly broad and illegal freeze of all foreign assistance funding, he publicly announced exceptions for a limited set of programs, including life-saving aid. The basic idea being that we probably shouldn't let HIV spread rampant, and we probably shouldn't let food grown right here in America rot in ports while children starve. Causing mass death through pointless negligence is not really a good strategy for bolstering our global reputation. It is cruel, and it is self-defeating. So as Secretary of State, he made the exception. But DOGE had other plans, because on the rare occasion that what was left of USAID staff who had not been sidelined was able to clear these payments through the agency's interim leadership, surprise, DOGE staffers would veto those payments anyway. Keep in mind, we don't know about this because the DOGE disclosed it or state disclosed it. We know only because of reporting. That, Mr. President, is not how this works. Congress and the American people we represent should not be out of the loop, especially given the serious stakes here and the serious questions that remain, like on what authority did they veto those payments? Whose orders did they use to overrule the Secretary? I, for one, would very much like to know, because while the Secretary is guilty of plenty of the tax on his workforce and programs, it certainly seems like the Secretary of State got steamrolled on numerous occasions without even knowing it. And if that's the case, who are we supposed to talk to with questions about states' funding needs? The Secretary or the two DOGE minions who actually have their hands directly on the levers of power here? And let's not forget about what happened at Treasury. DOGE wanted access to our most secure systems. Agency officials told them no. And then the agency officials were told they're fired. That sent a chilling message to our federal workers. You stand up to DOGE at your own peril. And it's not just Treasury. DOGE has been worming its way into department after department, making a beeline for the most sensitive systems, including ones storing my constituents' sensitive financial data, and bulldozing over anyone who stands in the way for any reason. We don't even know who all of these people are or whether they even have security clearances. They have even had people fired for denying them access to classified material beyond their security levels. That is how completely unchecked their power has become. And we have incredibly little insight into what they are actually doing with those sensitive systems. We've seen DOGE claim they can only view some data. That's already deeply concerning, but there are also plenty of indications they have been given more power at times, and they are interested in tinkering around with some of these systems too, or unaccountably blocking payments like we saw at USAID. Let's talk about the Defense Department, because first, Secretary Hegseth was saying he wanted to revive the, quote, warrior spirit at the department, but now he's telling employees to reply to DOGE's weekly emails. He is firing thousands of defense personnel, and he's asking every corner of DOD to propose major cuts. So as an appropriator trying to write full-year bills that fund our military, which is it? Major increases or major cuts? And who do I ask about the department needs? Is this up to the Secretary or up to DOGE? And who at DOGE is even steering this ship? We need to know this kind of thing, and we really needed to know yesterday, because we have a deadline coming up for funding the military, and we have some serious questions for whoever is in charge about how the administration is approaching things. And when I say whoever is in charge, I don't mean who is in charge on paper, because it seems like there is a big disconnect. I mean who is actually making decisions and driving actions at our agencies and at DOGE for that matter. Because look, First, Elon was running DOGE with Vivek. Then it was just Elon. Then it supposedly wasn't Elon at all. But then Elon kept right on posting about hiring decisions like someone in charge and rehiring an individual who resigned after their blatant racism came to light. And he kept right on doing press availabilities with the president in the Oval Office to discuss his work at DOGE like someone in charge. So it sure looks like Elon is still head of DOGE. And even after we were all finally told with great supposed certainty DOGE is actually being run by another person no one had ever mentioned, we then promptly learned, oh, she's on vacation. And the very next day, we saw Elon briefing the cabinet on what he is doing at DOGE. If that all seems confusing or contradictory, I don't think it's an accident as much as a smokescreen, one that seems designed to hide the obvious fact that Elon Musk is the one who's calling the shots at DOGE. And all of us here in Congress really need to know that, because he is the richest man in the world, with billions actually in government contracts on the line. And he is apparently in charge of his own conflicts of interest. We're just supposed to trust him? Has he recused himself from a single decision? We haven't heard anything about that. As a steward of taxpayer dollars who wants to make sure the bills we write are implemented to help my constituents, not Elon Musk's bottom line, I would like to know. Did the owner of SpaceX recuse himself from decisions gutting NASA? Did the owner of Tesla interfere at all in the funding freezes that hurt his competition in the electric vehicle market? Does the guy who posted criticizing Verizon's work for FAA and pitching his own company Starlink as an alternative have anything to do with the reports the government may reverse course now on the Verizon contract? Did the guy selling satellite internet have any role in halting funds that were helping my constituents access to broadband? Or what about all the watchdogs that have been fired? People reviewing Neuralink devices at FDA. People at the agency that reviews the safety of Tesla's self-driving cars. Or the Inspector General looking into Elon's connections to foreign governments. Despite what Musk likes to pretend, it is not in the slightest bit transparent for him alone to be deciding what he hides and what he shares about his role in government. Nor is it transparent when DOGE is posting updates that are often completely inaccurate, from getting basic math wrong to getting wrong basic timelines of what Trump did versus Biden, to not understanding how our contracts work and counting the same cuts over and over and over again. They aren't being transparent. They are mudding up the waters with falsehoods and disinformation and making it that much harder for us to write meaningful funding bills in the next few days. I mean, if DOGE doesn't even know what programs they've cut and how much they've cut, how are we supposed to understand how these decisions hurt our constituents? How are we supposed to write legislation that rejects the cuts we find harmful or even aligns if there are areas of agreement? Mr. President, we need real answers from DOGE, and we need them as soon as possible. So once again, I am requesting that Elon Musk come before Congress for a hearing to be held accountable for the American people. Tell us, what exactly are you doing? Why are you firing federal employees whose salaries are covered by fees, not by taxpayer dollars? Why are you firing our veterans by the thousands who are doing work to support our communities? Why are you planning to fire the people who make sure seniors get their Social Security checks? Who are the people who work for you? How were they vetted? What are your long-term plans for this agency? And based on what authority are you overruling our secretaries, directing federal workers, and ignoring the laws we pass here in Congress? America's waiting. We are losing valuable time. Congress and the American people deserve answers, and we need them to do their jobs. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Washington.
I rise to speak today on important public policy issues related to my state's economy, and appreciate the opportunity to follow our senior senator, Senator Murray, who was articulating the impact of some of these so important issues. Public policy issues on the state of Washington. Trade is the lifeblood of the state of Washington and our economy. Farmers in my state export $7.5 billion worth of agricultural products a year. That was the number from 2023, $7.5 billion. So anytime somebody starts a trade war, I guarantee you're going to get our attention. Under the president's trade war, the farmers in my state are going to be the first victims. Trump said to our farmers yesterday on Truth Social, quote, tariffs will go external on products on April 2nd. Have fun, end quote. Have fun? Have fun? When retaliatory tariffs strike our farmers, just as they did in the first Trump administration, it's not going to be fun, it's going to be a nightmare for our farmers. And many of the farmers in my state worry that they will be able to farm at all. It's not like they're going to lose farmland. There are rich people, billionaires, software executives who will buy farmland. We're going to lose farmers. I know this because we've already been through this trade war with many of my farmers struggling to overcome the damage that was wrought during the first Trump administration. The last time we went down this road, we lost the apple market because of retaliatory tariffs. We had a $120 million market that basically collapsed practically overnight in India. And I traveled to India and worked hard over several years to lift those tariffs. And now we finally are back growing our exports exponentially, but the market still isn't fully recovered. And now people are questioning what's going to happen next. I heard from one grower in my state who said, quote, the alarms in ag are sounding. The band has stopped playing, and the last lifeboats are leaving the ship. We cannot endure another cycle similar to the one that was started 7 years ago when tariffs were first put in place, and without meaningful, long-lasting solutions, you may very well be looking at the last generation of farm families, end quote. That's just one of my constituents. He doesn't sound like he's having fun. These family legacies built on generations of work cannot be lost in a trade war. You can't get them back once they're gone. I hope my colleagues will slow down on this tariff tirade. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to set duties and regulate foreign commerce. However, Congress has spent the last 80 years delegating its tariff authority to presidents. You could say, okay, well, that might have been okay because previous Democrat and Republican presidents worked to lower tariffs and to open up markets. I have voted for many of those trade agreements. But this president, I believe, is abusing this authority. He calls it an emergency. He's using the trade wars to supposedly force countries to do things like changing their border policies. I believe it's time for Congress to start taking back some of that power and considering how we're going to protect the family farm. We know this, that in my state, families are paying more for groceries. They're paying more at the gas pump, they're paying more at electricity bills, and they are seeing the stock market plummet because as businesses grapple with Trump's unnecessary trade war, businesses are concerned about the long-term impacts of the supply chain and the costs of those tariffs. The American people want to see the administration tackle inflation and the high cost of everything. When President Trump was on the campaign trail, he talked about inflation. He said, quote, starting day one, we will end inflation and make sure that America makes affordable again and bring down prices on all goods, end quote. Well, I don't think that's what's happening today. The Wall Street Journal editorial board put it well this morning when they wrote, quote, "Trump takes the dumbest tariff plunge," end quote. I agree. We don't need to be doing this. These tariffs are a tax on groceries bought by every American. Canada is the largest exporter of meat to the United States, while 77% of fresh vegetables are imported from Mexico and 11% are imported from Canada. So costs are going up on every American who is buying, and that means they will also buy less. The tariffs on Canada and Mexican goods that President Trump is planning would cost American families an estimated $1,200 per year. According to Anderson Economic Group, tariffs could raise the price of a new car as much as $12,000. I'm pretty sure nobody has extra money for a new car. Housing costs, one of the biggest drivers on inflation. But President Trump's tariffs would drive up the cost of construction material, making it even more expensive to address our housing shortage, slow our new home construction. And one analysis found that tariffs could push home construction up by 4 to 6% over the next 12 months. I can tell you, we already have expensive housing in the Northwest. We can't afford another 4 to 6%. And the tariffs also create supply chain disruptions, making it harder to find alternative sources of materials, delaying projects that are already underway. And these short-term sticker shocks will put long-term pressure on housing affordability, making the problem worse, not solving it. Just last week, when people want to talk about GDP and where this is going, it's amazing that the Atlanta Fed was forecasting GDP growth over 2% for the first quarter of 2025. That's literally what this line here was discussing, that the consensus was 2%, and even the Fed was weighing in on that. But we can see when we got to February, we fell off a cliff. We fell off a cliff. And why? Because now the Atlanta Fed is saying we had one swing of 5% in just 1 week, and now this drop is the representation of a cliff that President Trump is pushing the American economy over. So you can see they're going down to negative, not just zero growth, but negative. Mr. President, we can't afford that, and we can't afford the stock market dropping 700 points yesterday. The only way that we can work together is that if my colleagues here will start talking about these tariff issues. We don't need to weaken our institutions here, we need to strengthen them. And our colleagues need to work together to resolve these issues. I would say, too, that as my colleagues start to plan how we deal with these budget issues, that we should also keep in mind that some of the cuts that these agencies have been facing are really the cuts to some of the most technical jobs the United States government has. Whether you're talking about NOAA, or the National Weather Service, or the National Institutes of Health, or the National Science Foundation, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they've all been targeted for reductions. These agencies are critical to our economic growth and to our security. And at a time when we are seeing more extreme weather events, or more floods, or more wildfires, why shouldn't we be investing more in weather forecasting, not less? And when you look at NOAA workers who support our commercial and recreation and tribal fisheries, they employ 1.7 million people, including thousands in the state of Washington. Why would you cut specialized workforce that are helping support the growth of GDP? Because you want to basically cut those technical workers at the same time you're putting on tariffs? In 2023, the National Institute of Health awarded $1.2 billion in highly competitive grants to the state of Washington, 65 different organizations. This supported 12,000 jobs and generated $3 billion in economic activity. But DOGE wants to cap the overhead expenses of research. University of Washington Medicine tells me that this would leave them with shortfalls and that they might have to stop clinical trials that are underway. You can't just stop medical research like it's a faucet. Once halted, the research, the data, the clinical trials, the patients, the laboratories, the equipment, all that led to innovation will be lost. You think you just turn that back on? You know, these kinds of ideas sound great, but they're not well thought out. It's literally throwing tax dollars away. Tonight, my guest at the State of the Union will be Dr. Paul Lang from the University of Washington. With support of federal funding, Dr. Lang helped develop early detection tests for prostate cancer. Because of these tests and other treatment breakthroughs, we have seen a decrease in the death rate from prostate cancer. From 1993 to 2022, it dropped by 1/2. Significant progress. That is why we need research dollars to save lives. Similarly, the Washington State University researchers actively test on novel drug treatment for advanced prostate cancer at Sharma Lab. If its work is disrupted, they say that, quote, risk potentially is high, not being able to replace data and endangering the ultimate viability of potentially life-saving treatments, end quote. There are lives that might not be saved because of these budget cuts. So it is time, Mr. President, that Congress get involved, that we fight for the science that we believe will save lives, move our country forward, and grow our GDP, and help our farmers by stopping these trade wars and putting our farmers back in charge of growing an economy for the future. I hope that we don't cut ARS funding that USDA depends on. I hope that we will give hope to our future constituents in the growth that we need to grow our economy instead of cutting our opportunity. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I have 3 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leader.
Duly noted.
Thank you. Mr. President, on November 5th, President Donald J. Trump was elected to a second term on the... Mr. President, anyone who has kids can attest to this. It is incredibly difficult to find affordable, accessible, high-quality childcare. When I was a student in Tuscaloosa, I had gone back to school with essentially a newborn and an 11-month-old and decided, why not? Law school sounds good. I joke that on the scale of bad ideas I've had in my life, and I've had a few, that one is without a doubt number 1. In the midst of trying to figure out my 1L year, I also had to figure out childcare. And it was challenging for me to find a place where I could get both of my kids in. So at the very beginning, there I was, taking one child to one place and one child to another, all hoping to show up at torts on time, and then get back before you get fined, picking them both up and hoping traffic didn't keep me from being late. When my husband and I had the opportunity to move to Birmingham, where he began his new career, and I had 1 more year of law school left, we got them immediately, both of our kids, into one child care facility. But the check that we wrote, Mr. President, wow, it felt like I was writing a check for a college tuition and not a check for a 3- and 4-year-old to be cared for and loved and educated during the day. Well, I tell you what, the problem, that was, 13 years ago? It's only gotten worse. Child care costs had been increased. They've actually increased 36% over the last 10 years, actually outpacing inflation. It's gotten to the point where parents, on average, y'all, are spending 22% of their income on childcare. The median annual price of childcare in this country is about $15,600. The cost is crushing for so many parents. It's also prohibitive. So ask yourself this: how many married couples do you think about having another child? They want to, and they start looking at the dollars and cents and feel like they can't financially afford it? To my fellow Republicans, don't we want to incentivize rather than deter parents from starting their families? And how can we, as the party of life and the party of families and the party of parents and the party of workers, neglect to make that easier? If our goal is creating a comprehensive culture of life, and that should absolutely be our goal, then we have a role to play in the childcare space. But families are not the only ones that are affected by the current state of childcare in this country. The amount of money that the American economy loses annually because of childcare, the challenges that we face as a result of the affordability and accessibility are staggering. Our economy loses $122 billion a year. 74% of mothers and 66% of fathers either have to leave work early, arrive late, or be absent because of last-minute changes in childcare. 59% of part-time or non-working parents say they would go back to work. They want to go back to work. But unfortunately, they don't have access to quality childcare at a reasonable cost. That isn't good for the broader economy, and it isn't good for American workers. President Trump has made it clear he wants America to be a place that builds things once again. He wants to unleash a golden era for made in America excellence, where the skill, hard work, and ingenuity of our people accomplishes the impossible and changes the world. To accomplish that goal, which I wholeheartedly agree with, we need to tackle the child care affordability crisis. Ultimately, this is a workforce crisis as well. That's where a two-pronged approach that I have introduced today alongside a number of my colleagues, Mr. President, comes into play. With the Child Care Workforce Act and the Child Care Availability and Affordability Act, it consists of targeted investments in families and small businesses. It modernizes our existing tax credits so that our policy reflects our current economic reality. It's a good example of common sense policymaking. We are not creating or growing another entitlement. We are letting Americans keep more of their hard-earned taxpayer dollars in a manner that grows our economy and gives people an opportunity for their American dream. And we're offering job creators an incentive to invest directly into hardworking people with child care related benefits. We'll help couples who want to have more children. We'll help parents be able to re-enter the workforce after having kids. And we'll help our job creators, especially small businesses, recruit and retain workers. This legislation is pro-family, it's pro-Main Street, it's pro-growth. For the first time in years, the Republican Party controls both chambers of Congress, Mr. President, and the White House. We have an opportunity we can't afford to waste. If we truly are the party of parents and families and hardworking Americans, we have an opportunity to prove it. Let's address the child care crisis in this year's tax package, Mr. President. I think America will be better for it. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.